In 1806, a young Boston merchant had an idea so absurd that most people around him probably thought it bordered on madness. He wanted to cut frozen water out of New England ponds, load it onto ships, send it to the Caribbean, and sell it to people living in tropical heat. Not silver, not sugar, not spices, ice. This was long before refrigeration, long before electric freezers, and long before cold drinks were something ordinary people could take for granted. At the time, ice was local. It was seasonal. If you lived in a hot climate, you did not expect to have it. Certainly not imported across oceans. And yet one man believed that frozen water could become a global business. His name was Frederic Tudor. And this is the story of the startup everyone mocked that made ice a global business. If this were a modern startup pitch, it would sound terrible. The founder is young and overconfident. The product melts. The shipping costs look insane. There is no proven market. Most customers do not even know they want it. The infrastructure barely exists. The early launches fail. The founder burns through money, wrecks his finances, lands in debt, and keeps insisting the idea is still brilliant. Which makes this one of the most modern business stories in history. Because Tudor was not just selling ice. He was trying to create demand where almost none existed. He was trying to build logistics before the market was mature. He was trying to convince people that something they had never considered essential would soon feel indispensable. That is not just trade. That is founder behavior. Frederic Tudor was born in 1783 into a wealthy Boston family, which meant he had something a lot of ambitious people in history did not have: room to take risks. He was not a poor laborer gambling his last coin. He came from privilege. But privilege alone does not explain what happened next, because plenty of rich young men inherit comfort and never build anything unusual. Tudor chose obsession. In the early 19th century, New England winters produced something that looked abundant to the point of absurdity: frozen lakes and ponds full of thick, natural ice. In Massachusetts, winter created a resource that people nearby could harvest easily for local use. But Tudor looked at that frozen landscape and saw something else. He saw export potential. More specifically, he saw the Caribbean. People living in places like Martinique, Havana, and other hot weather ports had wealth, status, and endless heat. If you could deliver ice to them reliably, you were not just offering a novelty. You were offering relief, luxury, status, and eventually utility. The problem was that almost everyone else thought this was ridiculous. And to be fair, it sounded ridiculous. Ice melts. Ships are slow. The Caribbean is hot. Transport is expensive. Storage is difficult. Even if some ice survived, who exactly was going to build the warehouses, buy the tools, educate the customers, and create a regular market for it? Tudor's answer was basically, "I will." That confidence cost him a lot. In 1806, still in his early 20s, Tudor began shipping ice from New England to the Caribbean. The early results were rough. Some shipments melted badly, markets were uncertain. Local infrastructure was weak. Customers had to be taught why ice was worth paying for in the first place. That is a point modern audiences sometimes miss. Tudor was not entering an established market and competing on price. He was trying to invent the market. And inventing a market is expensive. You have to persuade people to change habits. You have to solve problems nobody has solved before. You have to keep going through embarrassing failures because if you stop too early, everyone concludes they were right to mock you. That happened to Tudor again and again. He lost money. A lot of it. He went into debt. At one point, he ended up in debtor's prison, which is about as clear a signal as history can give that the business was not going well. Imagine the humiliation of that. You come from a good family. You believe you are building an astonishing new trade, and instead of becoming a visionary merchant, you become the guy who gambled on shipping frozen water to the tropics and wrecked himself. That should have ended the story. For most people, it would have. But the thing about certain founders is that failure does not necessarily kill their conviction. Sometimes it hardens it. Tudor kept going because he was convinced the problem was not the idea itself. The problem was execution. And in that, he was probably right. The concept was not impossible. It was just brutally hard. Tudor needed 3 things to make it work. First, he had to reduce melting during transport. Second, he had to build storage and distribution systems in hot climates. Third, he had to teach customers to want ice often enough to create repeat demand. That is a lot more than selling a product. That is building an ecosystem. One of the breakthroughs that helped Tudor came from insulation. Ice, it turned out, could survive much better than people assumed if packed correctly. Materials like sawdust, which was cheap and widely available, worked surprisingly well as insulation. That meant harvested ice could be stored, packed into ships, and transported more efficiently with less loss than earlier skeptics imagined. This sounds like a small detail, but it was huge. A lot of impossible businesses stay impossible until somebody finds the unglamorous operational trick that changes the math. In Tudor's case, ice was not saved by romance or boldness. It was saved by better process. And better process kept improving. Over time, Tudor and others in the trade improved harvesting techniques, storage methods, and delivery systems. Ice houses were built in tropical locations to preserve the product after arrival. That mattered just as much as the shipping itself. It was not enough to get the ice there. You had to keep it usable once it landed. Again, very modern. The first version of a startup is often not just the product. It is the product plus the entire infrastructure the product needs to survive. Tudor also had to solve the culture problem. People in hot climates did not automatically know what to do with imported ice. Some wealthy buyers enjoyed it as a luxury. But Tudor needed more than occasional curiosity. He needed habits. He needed customers to start imagining new uses for cold. Cold drinks, chilled desserts, preserved food, medical use, social prestige, daily comfort. This was one of his real talents. Tudor was not merely transporting ice. He was selling the experience of cold. That is what made the business scalable. A product becomes powerful when it moves from novelty to expectation. At first, people marvel at it, then they enjoy it, then they begin to feel inconvenienced without it. That transition is where markets are made, and Tudor helped force that transition. He kept pushing into new places, and eventually one of the boldest moves of all came into view. India. Now, that sounds even more absurd than the Caribbean. Shipping ice from New England to India in the 19th century sounds like satire. It sounds like the kind of idea people invent to demonstrate that businessmen can convince themselves of anything. And yet it happened. Ice harvested from New England was shipped all the way to Calcutta. Against enormous odds, enough of it survived to prove that the business could reach astonishing distances. Colonial elites in India, like wealthy consumers elsewhere in hot climates, quickly recognized the appeal of cold drinks and chilled luxury in oppressive heat. Once again, what sounded impossible became real, and every successful long-distance shipment did more than generate revenue. It changed perception. That matters in business. At first, your idea sounds laughable. Then it sounds eccentric. Then it sounds bold. Then, if it works often enough, it starts sounding obvious. That is one of the cruelties of innovation. Once a business model succeeds, people forget how insane it looked at the beginning. Tudor's trade eventually became large enough that he earned a nickname, the Ice King. That is a dramatic title, but in this case it fits. He helped build an industry around something most people had never imagined could be globalized. Natural ice harvesting became a serious business. New England ponds and lakes became economic assets not just for nearby towns, but for faraway consumers across the Atlantic and beyond. And Tudor's success was not just about luck or persistence. It depended on a very specific insight. He understood that abundance in one place could become luxury in another. That sounds simple, but it is one of the great engines of trade. A thing can be cheap where it originates and precious where it arrives. The entrepreneur's job is to notice the gap before everyone else does. Tudor noticed that gap in frozen water. But there is another reason this story works so well today. It is not just a trade story. It is also a story about creating desire. Many businesses succeed because they meet an obvious existing need: food, shelter, tools, medicine. Tudor's business was different. He had to help teach the market what it wanted. That puts him much closer to certain modern founders than he first appears. Think about how many major businesses did not simply satisfy demand. They cultivated it. They made people imagine a different way of living, and then sold them the habits that came with it. Tudor did that with cold. He was, in a sense, commercializing a sensation. He was selling temperature as a product. He was taking something seasonal and local and turning it into something global and aspirational. That is a remarkable leap. It also came with brutal limits. For all its ingenuity, the natural ice trade depended on climate, labor, shipping networks, and urban demand. It required cutting ice in winter, moving it fast, preserving it carefully, and distributing it through vulnerable storage systems. It was physically demanding, logistically fragile, and exposed to weather. In other words, even at its peak, it was a business built on a race against nature. And history eventually overtook it. Mechanical refrigeration would later transform the entire landscape. Once humans could generate cold directly, on demand, without depending on frozen ponds in New England, the old ice empire began to lose its edge. The future of cold would belong to machines, not harvested winter. That makes Tudor's story even more interesting, not less, because he built a global industry that now feels almost impossible to imagine. He scaled something temporary. He industrialized a natural condition. He created an international business around a product that was always destined to be replaced by better technology. That is not failure. That is historical timing. For a period, he solved the problem better than anyone else could. And in doing so, he changed daily life. Cold drinks became more accessible. Food preservation improved. The expectation of comfort in hot climates grew. The commercial value of refrigeration, long before artificial refrigeration dominated, became obvious to markets that had once ignored it. That is a major achievement. And it all began with a proposal that sounded stupid. That part of the story may be the most important, because it reminds us that some of the best business ideas do not sound impressive when first explained. In fact, they may sound embarrassing. They may seem too fragile, too impractical, too early, or too strange. People laugh because they are judging the idea in the present tense, while the founder is imagining the future tense. Tudor's genius was not that he never failed. It was that he kept treating failure as evidence that the system needed improvement, not that the vision was worthless. That is classic founder psychology. Sometimes inspiring, sometimes delusional, often both. And in Tudor's case it worked. He endured ridicule, debt, prison, logistical disasters, and years of uncertainty. But he kept building, he kept shipping, he kept refining, he kept educating the market. Eventually, the thing everyone mocked became an industry. So when we call this episode the startup everyone mocked that made ice a global business, that is what we really mean. Not just that Frederic Tudor sold ice. Plenty of people sold ice locally. What Tudor did was much stranger and much harder. He imagined that frozen ponds in New England could feed a luxury and utility market across the world. He built infrastructure before demand was mature. He created customers by changing expectations. He survived failures that should have ended the business. And he turned one of the most ordinary substances on Earth into a global commercial product. That is not just a quirky historical anecdote. That is one of the great entrepreneurial stories. Because every generation celebrates founders who seem visionary after they succeed. But the real test is whether they can survive the long stretch when they just look ridiculous. Frederic Tudor lived in that stretch for years, and then he outlasted it. He took a product that melted, a market that barely existed, and a business plan that sounded laughable. And he built an empire of cold. Not bad for a man selling frozen water.